I'm Ben Smith,
I'm Nayeema,
and this is Mixed Signals from Semafor Media.
Today we're going to talk about the ethics of sexting with your sources and the art of winning, which we have to tell you is two separate things.
Yeah, very, very rarely do they go together.
Not a Venn diagram that intersects. In the first part of the conversation, Ben, I'm going to have to ask you some tough questions because you have recently been embroiled in a controversy which involves sexting New York Magazine star reporter Olivia Nuzzi and former presidential candidate RFK Jr.
That sounds like quite a group chat, but unfortunately all my kind of like textual scrapes happen on what's left of Twitter.
I think it's called polytextual, and just for clarity, Ben was not actually in the chat.
Oh God, I hate that word.
Polytextual? It's good, it's good.
It's a coinage. What was the last one you tried to make happen? Boom scrolling?
Boom
I don't
scroll.
know.
But here's the thing, people are not having sex and they're just online a lot. So polytextual is kind of like the new polysexual.
I don't know.
So after we give you a little bit of a grilling, Ben, we have the second part of the conversation, which is going to be with the Bulwark's Tim Miller. He's a Republican operative turned media sensation who I think is giving Ezra Klein a run for his money. And we want to understand from him whether the center is the best place to be in media.
Viral centrism. Who knew?
Viral centrism. That's the future. And then, of course, we'll have Max Tani join us for some blind spots. But first, a break. So, Ben, before we put Tim in the hot seat, I got to put you there.
Please.
You know, as journalists, we're supposed to cover the story, not be the story, but sometimes you become the story. And that happened to New York Magazine star political reporter Olivia Nuzzi this past week when it came to light that she had been in some kind of weird emotional relationship with RFK Jr., trading inappropriate texts with him. And now it's happened to you because you so gallantly rose to her defense and treated the situation, I would say, a bit glibly in your own writing, Ben, yielding this headline from the New York Post. They said, Semafor's Ben Smith slammed for defending New York Mag reporter Olivia Nuzzi amid RFK Jr. sexting scandal.
What an incredible little media cycle. You reading a New York Post headline that is composed of like 3 tweets of people who are mad at me.
I love that that your first reaction here was to belittle the scandal, and now you'd like to belittle the backlash to the scandal.
Oh, I'm fully there. But I definitely, heard some, I thought, both legitimate and ridiculous criticism, which is, why you get into this thing.
So people can catch up with us. You wrote your media newsletter on Sunday evening, and you have a graph in there. You say reporters have all sorts of compromising relationships with sources. You end this to say sex barely rates because, quote, the most compromising of all and the most common is a reporter's fealty to someone who gives them information. That's the real coin of this realm. So unpack what you mean by that.
There's this temptation in our business, particularly right now, to say we are warrior priest, sword of democracy, heroes out there fighting for you every day. When in fact, we are professionals in a profession that's very important to democracy, but is inhabited by a bunch of eccentrics who, in order to get important information, often have long conversations and sometimes transactions around information, by the way. Like
Mhm.
when you see the word exclusive, that very, very often means somebody gave me this piece of information in exchange for a tacit guarantee it would be played in a positive light. That's genuine corruption. So I guess I try to resist the temptation to elevate journalists in a way that really just basically isn't how this profession actually works day to day.
You're sharing how you see the world and how you see the world of transaction in a way that is maybe eye-opening or confirmatory for people who don't trust the press. There are all kinds of ways in which powerful people and the press trade information, and there's a lot of ways to fillet your source without having to fillet your source. Sorry for that terrible image.
Yeah, you said that, not me, but that is in fact the term of art in newsrooms and has been for many years.
You do some sourcing for your newsletter, and you go to some, I would call is it a little selective sourcing?
It's always selective, yeah.
You speak to some British journalists. You say, quote, some British journalists naturally have been texting to ask what all the fuss is about. If you're not sleeping with someone in a position of power, how are you even a journalist? And then you quote the advice writer, Heather Hefreleski, saying that the world would be much more exciting with more Nutzis around, but alas, the world is inhabited by anonymously emailing moralists instead.
I would say that second point is indisputable about the world being more interesting. Maybe that may not be the goal. The first point, by the way, was intended as a caricature of British journalists and the British elite, many of whom are married to each other in a very small world.
It's very incestuous.
I got a lot of feedback from British journalists that they don't quite do this, and they felt that that was a little over the top, a little hyperbolic,
So are you going to
which
issue
is
a
fair.
correction about the sex lives of British journalists, which sounds like a great reality series, by the way?
You can't correct hyperbole. You just apologize on podcasts. There's another pretty legit form of criticism, which was from
Mhm.
female journalists saying, "Hey, like, don't be so glib about this. This is something women sort of a kind of leering accusation women deal with all the time." I should have said that in the column. That's obviously true.
Yeah, that's very true. As women operating in any world, and particularly in journalism with the transaction of information, you have to navigate this femininity, which can be to your advantage sometimes and your disadvantage sometimes. And it can flip very quickly on a dime.
But as you say, like, it can be to your advantage. It can be to your disadvantage.
Yeah.
I think there's this desire to say we are professionals, we're robots, we operate, and in fact, this is such a weird human profession that everybody's navigating this stuff all the time. I don't think people love to talk about it.
You get to the point at the end of this newsletter. You say, "We're also in the business of trust as well as truth. And for those purposes, the appearance of conflict is in fact bad enough. It undermines reasonable people's trust, and there's really no defense for that." And so before I, Ben Smith, have to hand over my editor's badge, I should mention that our policy here at Semafor is that if you're having a romantic relationship with a subject of your coverage, for the love of God, please tell your editor.
Yeah.
Good advice. But maybe 2 things. If you had started with that caveat instead of ended with it, I think you would have diffused a lot of the critique, and I think you know that. Like, for the love of God, please don't do that, and if you must, please tell your editor so we can relegate you to a less sexy beat. And to have a star political reporter come into this kind of scandal is not good for the reporter, it's not good for New York Magazine, it's not good for journalism writ large, and I think that's where the ethics issue is, like, bigger than the kind of sideways treatment of like, "Oh, this happens in England, this happens here, this happen."
Oh, I mean, I agree with you, but I don't really know where that conclusion leads, right? Like, you should hire people who don't sin, I think, basically, as journalists, who don't make mistakes, who don't screw up. The sort of people without sin is a narrow talent pool. And I guess my bigger issue, although, like, again, obviously, don't do this, disclose it, and avoid these, like, a horrible appearance, but
Yeah.
and reality, but there is a broader issue that when we go out and say, all right, this was a terrible deviation, but will never happen again in the history of journalism, we are setting ourselves up for the next scandal. And people have to sort of realize it's true of journalists, it's true of other institutions, by the way. It's part of the challenge of institutions. They're populated by humans. What do you think of this? I've always thought of you as having actually, like, somewhat, like, less kind of moralistic views on this stuff than me.
I can't believe you don't think I'm a moralist, Ben.
Yeah, no, I think you're usually more laid back about this stuff than I am.
What, sleeping with sources?
Well, judging people who live complicated lives.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think that any industry is as virtuous as it projects itself to be. But I think on this issue of journalistic ethics, this is one where you're just given everything and how fraught the kind of environment and distrust of media is right now. I think it's one in which it's just like easier to make the disclosure than not.
Ye Wait, do you really think so? Like, which paragraph would you put the, "By the way, I'm sexting with RFK" disclosure in, and do you really think people would be like, "Thank you for that transparency"?
No, in this case, I think the disclosure would not have sufficed. I think probably you needed to hand over the great reporting on the Joe Biden story and what people knew and didn't about Joe Biden's condition to somebody else at New York and let someone else write that story. Unfortunately.
I guess that's probably true. I mean, there's an old saying that in journalism, access is a curse, which is
Mhm.
basically true, and there's always an expectation from a source. They give you an exclusive that you'll frame it the way they want. And I think, I certainly try to resist that, but I do think that, like, the most corrupt transactions in journalism are always about information. It's always the person who gave you information is the one who is you doing that to try to control the narrative. And I think, in a way, the people who get up on their high horses and denounce these messier, uglier, more obviously gross transgressions are are almost misdirecting from what are always the actual corruption of the day-to-day corruption of journalism. Yeah.
Yeah, the golden handcuffs of access. What is like the most the thing that you most regret in terms of handcuffs you've accepted from a source?
This, I actually have an access as a curse story, which is that and I've always regretted it's so stupid, but I've still always
Mhm.
regretted it, which is that after the 2008 LGBT debate in Los Angeles, I was
Yeah.
having dinner with a couple of big gay donors to the Clintons at the Chateau
Big gay
Marmont, I
donors.
believe.
Oh god, Ben.
Yes.
Okay.
Major gay donors, not large men.
Keep going. Yes.
Very. ordinary sized men. And Bill Clinton came up to the table, didn't know who I was, and
Mhm.
proceeded to tell a joke whose punchline was that when the good people of Arkansas and West Virginia found out that Rudy Giuliani's first wife was his second cousin, they would all immediately vote for him and that Hillary was doomed. He goes away and I get up from the table and run into the bathroom to write this down. And I come out of the bathroom and Hillary Clinton's press secretary, Jennifer Handley, is standing there waiting for me to come out of the bathroom because she knows what I did and says, "You know what? If you don't write that, you can just have dinner with the Clintons right now." And I thought, "Yeah, it's not that good a story, and
You traded it.
and it would be interesting to have dinner with them." And honestly, it was kind of an interesting dinner, but I just always regretted that and thought it was a mistake. And now I guess I'm actually breaking. There's some statute of limitation on not reporting really dumb jokes that I in some intuitive way have decided has expired.
Well, I have to say, did the dinner yield anything better than that joke? No, right? They were
No,
probably on guard.
no.
One senior comms officer wrote to me, "Ben needs an intervention."
Oh man, it's so far too late for that.
I know. I said, "Do you love to stick your neck out?" And he wrote back, quote, "To get chopped off. But Ben, I don't want you to get your neck chopped off. No, I like hosting this podcast with you."
Oh, thank you. But then, so I'm glad this wasn't an intervention. I would have gotten my back up.
All right, let's take a quick break and we'll be back with Tim Miller to talk about how politicians use reporters and vice versa, but not in the way that we have been talking about to date. All right, someone who's had a really interesting insight into how politicians use journalists, journalists use politicians is Tim Miller, our guest today. He's the host of the Bulwark Podcast, the author of the book Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican road to hell, and a YouTube sensation who's someone you've known for a long time, right, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, Tim, as Max Taney wrote in his piece on the Bulwark this week, who comes out of Republican politics. I met him when he was working for John McCain, and he's had this long journey from being a Republican flack to being the star of this new, basically never Trump Republican news outlet, the Bulwark. I mean, my thesis about this is that because they've been incredibly successful this cycle, is that there's this new space in the center where all of the energy for the last decade has been at the extremes, whether it's the Bulwark kind of leading Republicans over to the Democratic side, whether it's Barry Weiss and the Free Press leading former Democrats over to the right. There's this new energy that at some fundamental level represents energy in the center. Maybe that's a slightly Pollyannish view.
I see what you're saying. It's a bit of a revolving door. People are moving from one side to another. They might dip out the next election somewhere else. I think the other part of the thesis to this is that there are winners in the media in every political cycle. And 2024 is a political cycle that is benefiting the Barry Weiss Free Press, the Tim Miller Bulwark crowd. Give a little bit of history. Who are the ones that won in previous election terms?
Oh gosh, yeah. Every election essentially, gives birth to a new outlet. I mean, in '96 that's CNN, and in 2000 is the year of Fox News. That's when they ride the Monica Lewinsky scandal from being a kind of second-rate cable network to being, the central hub of Republican hatred of Bill Clinton. 2004, it's ABC's The Note. Politico, where I was in 2008, really that Obama election created it. And I was at BuzzFeed in 2012 when we and Twitter actually became these big forces. And this cycle, I do think that this energy in essentially energy kind of in and around this heated American political realignment has been central, particularly to the Bulwark. I mean, I do think it's a huge media business success story.
But I think it's interesting that like you just went through a kind of history and didn't even touch on Breitbart News, the right-wing ether that was really booming during this time that you're describing.
Breitbart was certainly the outlet of the Trump era. I mean, the thing is
Exactly.
that politics is the media business and vice versa, and so they're very intertwined, and so it's not a coincidence that you see these new outlets rise and fall in the political cycles.
Yeah, politics is the media, media is the politics, and certainly they help mint one another. And to talk more about that, we'll have Tim Miller join us. Let's have him come on.
You and I have obviously known each other quite a while.
Forever.
I think I first met you when you were working for John McCain, and then I remember when your job at the
Yeah.
RNC was to undermine Barack Obama's campaign for
Yeah.
president. But I guess just to situate people a little bit, so you grew up gay kid going to a Catholic high school in Colorado. What made you a Republican?
Great question. The cheesy and true answer is just like the cliches, like free markets and free people. My dad was an up from his bootstraps guy, like working class guy, did very well for himself. Was a Republican, but in the like, I don't want the government to take my money sense, not in like the he really cared about politics or was deeply involved in politics sense. It was me that was more of the political person in the family. Um, in a weird way, the inverse, kind of how the parties are now, which explains in part my shift, was like a formative time for me was Elian Gonzalez. Like I was very much bought into the like America is the shining city on a hill, land of milk and honey. We should be welcoming people here, and you had like the Janet Reno jackbooted thugs with their guns in Elian's face. Like that really bothered me back then. I guess I was probably in high school at that time. So those elements were what drew me to it initially. And then as I get into in the book, like the embarrassing like reality is like once I was in, I really just liked the competition. Like I was very competitive.
You loved campaigns. You could
I
feel it.
loved campaigning. I loved the hits on the other guys, the getting something in the front page of the paper, pitching up out of Ben Smith. Like
You were a great source.
thank you. I loved all that.
And that was that's what, see, we're talking before about Newtsy. This is what corrupts you. It's the information. It's nothing else.
Yeah, it's true at DC much more about the information, the access, the feeling important. The Newtsy article, she had that great interview with the anonymous Trump person who gives the I just this is such a salient anecdote for me. This whoever it was explains why they're an anonymous source in the Trump administration, like why do they give stuff to reporters, and he talks about just like that feeling when he accidentally gave away something and it ends up on like the front page, and how exhilarating it is and how much of a drug that is. Like I that was like the one time where one of these Trump enablers said something that I was like, I really see myself in that. Like I feel like I couldn't have gotten wrapped up in that for Donald Trump because of his unique awfulness, but like for somebody 2 ticks less awful, like I could have found myself there.
So you were running towards fame, relevance, what?
Like honestly, the
Power?
no, it's not power. It is the like the itch, the drug. Like it's almost like a somebody that's really into extreme sports, but I couldn't do sports, right? Like I'm look at my arms, right? But like the rush, like it was the rush really mostly for me. But the other stuff was also appealing, like the very minor, like kind of sad DC fame was embarrassingly appealing. Kind of being around it. It's actually more alluring to be the person next to the person in power. Like with power comes responsibility.
Yes.
Like being the person that gets to be around and give their opinion and be in the White House or be in the Air Force One, or I never got to go in Air Force One because all my candidates lost. But you know what I mean? Like that part is almost more alluring than actually like I want to be the secretary of whatever so I can decide what the regulation is.
Yeah, you don't have to be in meetings all day. You can go like cause a muck and play with fire in real ways. You call it the game in the book, like the rush of the game. But I think this is part of what we try to do in the show is unpack what the machine is really like and how it works behind the scenes. So take our listeners inside the machine. What's the kind of 2-minute playbook for when you were working in Republican campaigns using the media? How did you think about playing someone like Ben?
Yeah.
You can be specific. Tell us about a time you played Ben, if you like.
Oh man, I didn't prep for that. I'm sure I could have come up with something. Ben played me more than I played Ben. I would say almost certainly. Look, it's funny. How about this? I remember a conversation I had with Bannon very vividly. That was like almost just like Bannon was always so good at this, like playing the media game and understanding it. And I was pretty young, and then we're in the Breitbart embassy, we're sitting around that table in the dining room.
Can you give us a year, Tim, just to...
I think this was like 2013. So it was after Romney, before Jeb.
Okay.
And I was kind of building my relationship with him. And we were we were starting this group called America Rising that did opposition research on candidates. And like we were having just this very frank convo where he was saying, look, if you have something really, really good, like you should go to the Times. I've got a person if it's really, really good, I've got a person at 60 Minutes. I can help you get there. Like if you have stuff that you just need to kind of blow out of proportion a little bit, like we'll get Matt Boyle at Breitbart to it. Like it was just a totally blunt and frank. Like you would think I had never met him. We had emailed or whatever. I'd never met him. And you would think that like somebody that runs Breitbart would be like trying to puff up Breitbart. Like, you should give me your best material so we can put it in Breitbart. But no, like, he understood how the system worked. Like, the best way to do it would be to get a mainstream reporter to print something, because that's a little unexpected. Like, if the Times or 60 Minutes like goes after a Democrat, then people get more attention on it, and then the echoes will resonate through the various conservative media outlets, and the story can be expanded and drive that way. So like, that's just like one anecdote. I mean, there are a million different iterations of that. I did that same thing with like local reporters and Drudge. Like, I've had a lot of local reporters that loved me because we had good Drudge access, and Drudge drove traffic.
This is the Drudge Report by Matt Drudge.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if you're at the whatever, I'm not going to pick a real one, but if you're at the Charleston Post and Courier, and I give you a story about somebody in the state, and you publish it, and then I send that story to Drudge, and Drudge links it, and you get huge traffic. Like, that reporter's now coming back to me a lot. It's like, hey, like, give me more stuff. Like, they would be much more likely to write something that might be a little borderline. You know, they're not going to write fake news. But,
totally. Yeah. These are the sort of invisible transactions in political media, for sure.
Yeah.
You talk in your book about how the incentives really shifted, that Steve Bannon and Breitbart, for example, they would give glowing coverage if you took a position, say, on the border wall. So do you think that the media was kind of driving the train on some of this policy, or is Steve Bannon just an outlier who was just so good at it and so powerful in all the right ways?
No, I mean, look, the media in this case is like representative of people in some ways, right? Like, so sometimes there's like a corruption of the media that's like, you know, the old style that Ben would be more familiar with. Like, I ran the Observer and I'm the owner of it, and I also have this other business over here, and I want my reporter, you know what I mean? Like,
those were the days.
Yeah, that's like this old type of corruption. But when, especially kind of in the 2010s through 2020, like 2020 through, and still now, but a little less so, it's like the traffic, right? It's like you're trying, and this is Ben's book, but it's like, okay, we're trying to we're trying to get clicks, and so, and that, to get clicks, you need people to care about it, right? So the candidates started to get, I think, in both parties, pushed towards like more outlier views that had a ton of intensity.
Yeah, toward populism.
Yeah, towards populism, right? Because, you know, they would get positive coverage. You would notice this, right? You trust me. If you're on a campaign and your candidate, in my case, in many of these cases, it's the staff that's writing the tweet or the post, and like, you write it, it's about one issue. Oh, I think we should cut red tape, and it's like 4 retweets, and it's like, oh, I think that we should, you know, send the refugees that are in Idaho back to where they came from, and it gets 800 retweets. Like, you're going to want to, you know, your bias is to talk more about refugee removal, you know, than cutting red tape. And that doesn't necessarily even mean that refugee removal is more popular. It just, there's a intense audience for it. And so and then I think there are media outlets that were driven by those intense audiences that then informed the candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways to tell the story of the last decade, right, is these incredibly sensitive instruments that are digital media and digital politics, detecting the forces of populism and pulling in those directions. What I'm so curious about now is, it seems like you are following the heat to the center. Like, it's not like you're doing some dry think tank that nobody's looking at. You are getting great traffic. You are getting subscriptions. You're getting hundreds of thousands of YouTube views. And is there something happening there? Has the heat shifted back to the center? Is there some kind of energy in the center that others are missing that you've found?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't. I mean, I think that definitely there is a thirst from a couple of groups for media that is not predictably partisan. Like, there are people that are just getting sick of it, and so there's the inverse of us, like the other side of the horseshoe, that does pretty well, right? Which is Breaking Points, or whatever that's called, with like Sager and a little bit All In, kind of, right? Like, the sort of inverse side of the like, they also think that they're in the center, right? Like, Jason Kalakis would say he's in the center and I'm in the center, and we agree on almost nothing, right? Like, but it's because we're on the opposite sides of the little oval there. So I just think that there is an increased interest in people that are like, I don't want to just be told whatever the Democratic Party thinks or whatever the Republican Party thinks. I want somebody that's willing to challenge it and, you know, to be independent minded. So I do think that there's an appeal to that. And then I can't lie. Like, the other, like, the populist appeal that we have right now is just fundamentally to populist hatred of Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans.
Right. And that's a very powerful force.
Yeah. And it's a little bit more appealing. I do And I think that we're engaging and giving them information that they're interested in, but also it's like a tick more interesting to have somebody that was a Republican operative saying it than to have a Democratic hack saying it. And so I think that also obviously helps us.
Yeah, like in the Steve Bannon analogy, you could imagine someone saying now, like, "Oh, give it to Tim Miller before you give it to the New York Times." That's more interesting.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little dangerous now though to give stuff to because I just don't care anymore, and so I do, and I think that that's another thing that's been helpful for us.
Why don't you care?
Well, I'm not like Kamala Harris is not going to make me her press secretary, and I don't want to be it, you know. And like it's not. Who the hell knows? Like life is long. One of my buddies might run for Senate sometime, and I might get bored and decide I want to help like in 20 years. But like I'm not going up the ladder in any way. Like not only is Kamala Harris not going to hire me, like I'm not going to be Jake Tapper, right? Like nobody's hiring me to do that either, right? And so when you have a little freedom to just kind of let it rip, I think that we have a freedom to let it rip a little bit more than other places do.
Yeah, I hear you on the freedom. At the same time, I think like you could be bigger than Jake Tapper. I don't want to make your head go big here,
Oh,
Tim, but
thanks. But yeah, but that's in a different way, though. In a different way.
yeah, and you're getting, paid in Google ad revenue instead of being paid in, CNN money, which maybe is a healthier long-term payment partner. But I think
Yeah.
that what you're talking about, just to name some names, like when you were talking about extremism, you're talking about the rise of the Daily Callers, the Federalists, et
Yeah.
cetera. And now we're seeing the rise of the Bulwark, the Free Press. And Max Tani, our colleague's article on you, kind of grouped you with the Free Press. And Ben, I think, has said you're kind of the concierge service for Republicans becoming Democrats. And
Yeah.
Barry Weiss is more ushering people in the other direction,
Yeah.
helping Democrats be a bit more conservative. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of my colleagues would really not like this comparison, so we're gonna hope he doesn't listen to the podcast.
Which colleague?
JVL, Jonathan B. Last. But I think it's very apt. I mean, again, look, the Free Press does a lot of stuff. I find it morally is maybe too strong of a word, but I don't think so. Actually, like morally gross that they
Mm.
know Donald Trump is bad and they just don't write about it. Like they just don't write about it. Like if you just go to if you go to their site every day, the way that we're kind of similar is that like they are writing all the time about the excesses and outrages of the left, but oftentimes, not always, oftentimes they do so in a way that then also like takes some shots at the right. And as Ben points out, like I do think that helps kind of soften this blow probably of movement during the reorientation of our parties, which is definitely happening. And that is true of us, like in the sense that like I mean, I don't I did like I've not done a podcast on the Rashida Tlaib drama. I don't even really understand what's happening. Like, some like people on the left are mad that she said something and that somebody else was mean. Like, I'm just not talking about that.
But doesn't that, Tim, I mean, to me, like if you sort of continue that and Barry is ushering a group of Democrats over to the Republican Party, you are
Yeah,
ushering a bunch of a cadre of little, school children, Republicans across the street to
yeah.
the Democratic Party. Don't you think this does wind up with you as Secretary of Transportation or something? I mean, I think like that's where they usually stick the Republicans. But I mean, don't you think that basically we are headed back to a more stable bipartisan system just with slightly different people in it?
That's a good question. I think that there's some encouraging signs in that regard. Kind of the change in the coalitions, right,
Mm.
is going to naturally create room for like bipartisanship and maybe some just different types of ways that you thought would used to think about it in the past. But I don't know. I think that the other side to that is that there's something different happening now than was happening in the book era, and that is I wrote about the corrupting element in the book of the fact that like we treated it all like a game, like you said, and I was buddies with Tommy Vitor, and like we'd trash each other and then go get drinks, and like there's
Yeah.
something quaint about that now and fun and the old Tip O'Neill Reagan stuff, but there's also something kind of corrupting about it, and you can understand why actual voters started to be like, screw both of you guys, right?
Mhm.
Like I actually care about this stuff. Now the people working on it care, right? Like I was interviewing the actual Secretary of Transportation just a little bit ago, and we were talking about our mutual friend Elise Stefanik,
Mhm.
and one of the things that we discussed was just like if this ends, it's kind of hard to imagine going back to getting a beer with Elise Stefanik. Like once you've decided that the people on the other side are not just wrong but are bad, like are morally wrong, are black-hearted, man, it becomes very challenging to then be like, all right, well, it's 2026. That was weird. Now let's all work together on cap and trade.
Don't you think you and Elise Stefanik, I mean, like 2026, 2030, like you are going to have to like share the country with people like that, and you are ginning up
Yeah.
your audience to believe that that Trump's cadres are, as you said, kind of black-hearted. Isn't there? I mean, don't we ultimately sort of have to share this country? Have to, as media, figure out some limited amount of truth that we can agree on, things like that.
We do. We do have to share the country. I'm thoughtful about it. I try very hard to give credit when Republicans do good things. Like we had a couple very nice podcasts about Mike Johnson that did not do huge YouTube numbers when he did the right thing on Ukraine, and so I think that that's important to do, and I agree with that.
But the incentives of the system, right? They are not that.
No, the incentives of the system are not towards that. And also, I just don't really believe it. It's not like, if I really
Right.
woke up tomorrow and believed that, like, oh, it's going to be great, Republicans are going to see the light and come to the center, and the old Reagan party is going to come back, I would say it. I don't know. Maybe our numbers will go down. I don't believe it. And I think that what Elise Stefanik has done has been horrible. And so to me, it's kind of like, I don't feel like it's my responsibility, and I need to act responsibly, but it's not my responsibility to try to save the country from this like toxicity that Trump thrusted on it. It's like he's a toxic spill in a lake, and it's like, well, it's going to take a long time to dredge the lake. Like I just don't like, the lake isn't going to get dredged by 2025, even if he loses. And so anyway, I think that we are kind of in a generational period where these tensions are still going to persist. Maybe not when I'm 60, maybe not when I'm 70 with Elise, but it's going to take a little while.
But what do you think in the in between time? It sounds like you're not really seeing a shift toward the center. The incentive
No.
that's working right now is the incentive to hate Donald Trump and think anything else, basically.
Well, I again, this is why maybe thanks in part to my ushering the little
Mhm.
Republicans across the street, but I do think that there's some green shoots in the Democrats shifting to the center, and
Yeah.
I think maybe in the
Mhm.
long term that's a problem, because I think the younger Democrats, as evidenced by some of the Chapel Roan commentary this week, some of the younger Democrats might have more views out on the fringe, but like if you look at right now, just a 10-year period, I think the Democrats are going to stay close to the center. Kamala's moved to the center. If you
Mhm.
looked at the primaries, like when did I win a primary from 2010 to 2020? Never. And not me, but like the Bulwark type Democrats primaried Cory Bush and won, primaried Jamal Bowman and won.
Right.
Joe Biden won against Bernie Sanders. Kamala Harris, the Bulwark people kind of won the invisible primary with Kamala
Yeah.
Harris. She
Right.
starts kind of talking like John McCain a bit on the campaign trail. So I do think that like that is happening in the Democratic side, and I think that's encouraging.
There's a significant amount of kind of media criticism in what you do right now. So last week you went on a rant about how the media covers Trump in reaction to his interview with super right wing Wayne Allen Root, someone you describe as a quote deranged conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
Let's just hear a clip from your podcast, The
Okay.
Bulwark, on that.
Hey guys, it's Tim Miller from the Bulwark. Donald Trump did an interview last night with a deranged conspiracy theorist that you probably just haven't seen, because the media has gotten so used to him and grades him on such a curve and just can no longer be shocked by anything Donald Trump does, that he can just go on a totally unhinged rant with somebody that should be in an insane asylum, not at a quote unquote media outlet, whatever you call these kind of far right MAGA outlets.
So you're calling out something interesting. The media is constantly covering Trump, but they're no longer examining his craziness in a way, or the kind of the surrealness of what's happening. Is this a kind of corollary to Trump's "I can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, and things will keep moving along"? Like he can say and do anything, and the media just won't blink now.
Yeah, I mean, I try to not do that much media criticism because it is an easy mark, and there's so much media out there. I did in this case, and I do it sometimes because I can't help myself. But this is like a hobby horse of mine. I mean, has done 16 interviews with this guy, Wayne Allen Root. 16 interviews. Wayne Allen Root is not any less crazy than Alex Jones. Like he is a Seth Rich truther. He was one of the original birthers. Like he all of the election stuff in that later in that interview that I get into, they talk about how the post office is biased for Kamala. Like I just, if Kamala went on an equivalent interview site on the left, I don't even know what it would be, but I guess who is like skinny guy, Stu Peters, or like if she went on one of these lefty conspiracy sites and talked about how the mailman is gonna bias the campaign for Trump, like Lester Holt would have led with that the next night. So I think that's a fair criticism.
I mean, I think we sort of talked ourselves into the idea that we shouldn't be amplifying him, right, for a period, and you're still seeing some of that.
It's the stupidest thing that's been out there. That's that's a criticism I have also of there's another faction of the resistance that is big on not platforming or amplifying Trump, and I think that's very stupid and wrong. The more people see Trump, the less they like him. It's all 2016. It's all about the empty podium. It's all people still learning the Jeff Zucker lesson, but it's like that was 9 years ago now. So
Yeah, and people fighting the last war in a way, I think, too, and directing their anger at the media, at the independent media rather than at their real enemies. And I think you've somehow gotten out of that box, which is congratulations, because it's extremely annoying.
Thank you.
Though you are now, like, you are sort of one of us now. I mean, that's what's
Yeah.
sort of interesting. And like, and I do think about, you mentioned earlier, like when we get into next year, you'll be doing whatever it is that you're doing. Like, what are you doing? What is that? Is it media? Is it politics? Should I trust you? Are you asking me to trust you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that you should trust me more than most people. Because I tell you everything I think. I'm an open wound.
I find that
I
disturbing.
I do not go off the record with people anymore. I mean, every once in a while I'll like hear a tip that I don't know is true, and so I won't just like immediately regurgitate it onto the podcast, but like pretty much everything I know I say on the podcast, and so I think people should trust me more. And my political biases, I give my opinion. Everybody knows I thought Josh Shapiro should have been the VP. Everybody knows I thought Tim Walz is a little too far to the left. Everybody knows that I prefer Kamala to Trump. Everybody knows I hate JD Vance. So it's not like, why wouldn't you trust me? I'm giving my real opinion about everything, and that's what I intend to keep doing in 2025.
At what point do you no longer need the Bulwark?
Oh, Nayeema.
Come
No,
on.
I don't. Look.
This
But
is the
seriously.
recruiting portion of the call.
No, I don't mean to go to Semafor. I mean, Tim Miller live stream,
Yeah.
Tim Miller Inc.
I appreciate that. Here's the thing, like, and you guys got into this a little bit at the bottom of the article, and it also ties into Ben's question about, is this a political operative or a media operation?
Mhm.
Like, it's a media operation, but it is also a passion project. Like, we really care about this. We really were angered by what happened to the party and how everybody went along with Donald Trump. It pissed us off. We were disappointed. We were emotional about it. And the Bulwark was like a place where we brought people to. And like now we're growing and expanding. There are a lot of people that listen to the Bulwark and watch the Bulwark who are not from this space. But like our OG people were people like us. They were Republicans. They were let down.
Mm-hmm.
They felt despondent. And they came to us. And it was during COVID. So we had a community. We had these Zooms that we would do with everybody.
Mhm.
And so it's really important to me. Like the institution is really important to me. And the community is important to me. And so, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why it's worked. It's part of the reason why we don't have a business plan. But it's also part of the reason why I'm staying.
Okay.
It is incredible. I mean, you see the presidential cycles make and break media companies, and I mean, it was at Politico when it did that for us, and at BuzzFeed actually in 2012, and just obviously you've sort of caught this particular moment. It's pretty striking.
Thank you, man.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for being with us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate y'all.
So my takeaway is kind of, it's good to run to the extremes on Trump and to the center on everything else. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really love this thesis that like populism is maybe running its course in some ways, and there's this shift to the center, and there's energy there. But honestly, that's not his view. The most powerful force in American politics for the last 8 years has just been absolute hatred of Donald Trump, and that's the force he's riding more than anything else.
Yeah.
Which is it's a kind of centrism, but it's a very reactive force.
I think there's a lot of running away from institutions that feel blemished by their past history, big news publications, et cetera, and running towards something that's new and novel, which always makes me wonder, like, what happens when the new novel, slightly more center of center thing pops up. And, it's still a huge amount of fragmentation. I don't think there's a lot of people who are consuming, like juror number 1 in the Donald Trump trial, consuming the New York Post and MSNBC and Fox News and the New York Times and the
We
Bulwark
love
and
that
this.
guy.
Like, that person doesn't exist. And so it'll be interesting to see how the audience reshapes the incentives, because that's really what we saw with Fox News, Dominion. Everything that went down there is, how does the audience start to lead you in a way that even one of the most powerful media tycoons in the world, if not the most powerful media tycoon in the world, Rupert Murdoch, can't be a counter to.
That's the central point. That's a great point.
All right. Well, if you want to hear more from Tim, you can check out the Bulwark Podcast, and we'll take a quick break. We'll be back with Max Tani for Blind Spots. All right. We're back with Max Tani. Max, we're just speaking to the subject of your last great story, Tim Miller.
Oh, that's great. Has all the fame gone to his head?
I don't think it's gone to his head. We asked him, how long does he need the Bulwark? And he did protest and talk about how much he enjoyed his colleagues and working there. Said like a true Hollywood star, I would say. So I give him, 6 to 12 months?
I do feel like mission-driven media tends to kind of burn really bright and sometimes kind of quickly. Ben, do you think that that's like kind of the case, like media organizations that are driven by like one single kind of idea?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, stopping Donald Trump. I think that when Trump goes away, a lot of the energy around places like the Bulwark may subside. But right now, it's, I mean, incredibly vital and successful, and has
Yeah.
really made a connection with millions of people. And I think that doesn't totally go away.
Yeah. But when people leave the Bulwark, they'll stay with Tim Miller. That's my bet. I think he's minted his stardom. and
That's
he's
the
very good
problem
at
with
it.
media these days. Can't control your talent.
I can't control your talent. All right. Well, Max, control us a little bit. Give us some blind spot that we have not been listening, seeing.
Well, I was curious if you guys saw this news yesterday that we broke that Kamala Harris is going to be appearing on the All the Smoke podcast sometime in the near future. She taped with the hosts Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson yesterday. For those uninitiated folks, the All the Smoke podcast is a basketball insider show where they interview essentially former players in the league. Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson were both on the We Believe Warriors. Steven was a bit of a controversial figure in the league because he was one of the people who was suspended for the Malice in the Palace incident, which was the big riot.
Nayeema and I
in
pretending we
Detroit.
know what you're talking about here.
I'm just like,
You
is
guys
this
don't
becoming-
remember that?
I mean, my general reaction is like, is this becoming the sports segment of our show? I
Our
feel like
business is
every
becoming
week-
the sports business. That's the truth of media. This is a real blind spot, Max. Keep going.
Yeah, tell us. What is the Malice in the Palace?
It was like Ron Artest, who later became Meta World Peace. He went up into the stands and there was a big riot and he got suspended. It's like one of the biggest things to ever happen in the NBA in the 21st century.
I do
have
remember that.
zero idea. Ben, do you
Anyway.
remember this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Ben gets some credit. I have zero idea.
So Kamala Harris has only done a limited amount of media interviews, availabilities, and she chose to go on with All the Smoke, which I thought was really interesting. And it's very clear what she's trying to do, which is that she wants to reach men. I'm sure as a listener of that podcast, I think most of the people I know who listen to that podcast are all men, a lot of straight men. I think it's a really interesting move by her communications team. And I was curious what you guys thought about this. Is it a savvy strategy? Is it too cute to kind of avoid national political media and just do this?
The devil is in the details. Like, how well does it go? Because that seems like a risky podcast. Like, I don't think that I would go on to the All the Smoke podcast. I don't think I would be, endearing myself to its fans. I don't think I'd be, the coolest, sportiest chick to ever hit that podcast. I don't know if Kamala Harris probably has, cooler, sportier vibes than I do.
Yeah, she's been a local politician for a long time. I bet she can talk about the San Francisco, whatever that team is, the Golden State Warriors.
Yes, they were members of the We Believe Warriors, which was the first good Warriors team in a very long time in the 2000s. At the same time that Kamala Harris was DA of San Francisco, so
I'm sure you can autoplay that. Even I don't. She's probably a basketball fan. I don't know, but honestly, I think it's too cute. I think that they have read a bunch of our columns about media fragmentation and and a bunch of had a bunch of meetings with various Reid Hoffman funded institutions and persuaded themselves that like the mainstream media is losing relevance. The real energy is over here and over here. And while that is a long term secular trend, it also just makes her look kind of lame and afraid to talk to serious interrogators. And like, I think a reasonable person sees her going on that podcast and thinks, wow, she's probably scared to do tough interviews. That's like a normal thing to think. And honestly, she's pretty good at doing tough interviews. She should just do them. I actually think I think they're being too clever with this stuff. I mean, they should do it. They should do it also by the way. Trump is everywhere. I don't see why she wouldn't be everywhere. But everywhere does include places that aren't just going to like ask you some questions about what you thought about the We Believe Warriors.
I kind of now listening to Ben, I'm like, it is a little cute. It's a little thirsty. And I don't even think it matters for us, like, journalists who are going to cry ourselves a river anyways, because we're not getting interviews with the vice president and presidential candidate. But I think it's more that the actual reporting shows, like conservatives I've spoken to in places like Pennsylvania, raise this issue of why isn't Kamala Harris giving more interviews? It's leveraged as a kind of attack point from the right to her, and I think that's a liability actually. Doing this without that.
I think not to create kind of an echo chamber of agreement. I agree that, it's always, I think that she does really well in confrontational environments. And that's one of the reasons why the debate was such a big win for her is she was able to really go out in a way that Biden couldn't and score some points, say the things that liberals wanted to say to Donald Trump for 4 years or 8 years or whatever. But at the same time, I do think that I'm sympathetic to the idea that they feel that there's just a large number of people, in particular men, who don't care about the national media at all, who won't see her on CNN or, see some interview. They might see a clip kind of out of context. And actually they are listening to things like to all the smoke.
But the thing that throws me off on this is like it's not like the campaign isn't sending surrogates like crazy to every single news outlet and every single press. Ezra Klein just sat down with Pete Buttigieg. Tim Miller just sat down with Pete Buttigieg. So Pete Buttigieg is everywhere. Where is Kamala Harris? Where is the candidate? Right. And so
Yeah, although the problem she's trying to solve though also, and it is relevant, I think, is people don't know who she is. She's like in a certain way, people have a two-dimensional view of her, for better or for worse. And you see why they want to get her into these kind of more lean back settings where people just kind of see her as a busy human being. Because I think they're they have not that much time. People have this, or she's just, or she's new to them, and I think they're just trying to get her into settings where people can have some sense of her as a human being.
That's where I think that this strategy is actually pretty smart. I think that the real reason to do national media, to do a CNN or an NBC, the stuff travels. It obviously reaches a lot of people. But I think a big part of doing those interviews is to make it so that reporters are happy with you and they feel like actually they should give you some of the benefit of the doubt because they might get an interview with you or something like that. I mean, it's true. It is definitely true that if you feel like you can get an interview with someone, you might, maybe you will hedge a little bit on some areas or be more patient, or it's a carrot that you can dangle.
Okay, well, we'll wait for our Kamala Harris interview. Thanks, Max, for being with us. Thanks for listening to Mixed Signals from Semafor Media. Our show is produced by Max Tani, Allison Rogers, Sheena Ozaki, Max Toomey, Noah Friedman, and Andrea Lopez Cruzado. With special thanks to Britta Galanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, and Jules Zern. Our engineer is Rick Kwan. Our theme music is by Billy Libby, and our public editor is Cheryl Hines.
Oh, no.
If you like listening to Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review.
If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel.
And go to www.semafor.com and please subscribe to our media newsletter, which publishes every Sunday night.
Great website.
You can subscribe and you can see Ben sticking his neck out only to be cut off, as someone said to me.